Many so-called white Western intellectuals like to use the word or the phrase Judeo-Christian values as a broad summation of sort of Westerners' core values. And it is, of course, pretty much bullshit, and I'm going to get into that in this video. So first of all, Judeo-Christian has no relation to the ethics and morals of the Western world. I actually made a video on this whole topic about a year and a half ago, and I just went through and talked about how Judeo-Christian in terms of the American context doesn't make any sense, because America was not founded on Judeo-Christian morals, whatever that vague concept may be. So in the video I basically thoroughly debunked the notion that Judaism or Christianity is at all responsible for the democratic world we find ourselves in. But just quickly, I'm going to go over the main points of that video just to outline the core argument, and I think it is helpful to understand the context in regard to the argument I'm making today. So democracy and democratic values were largely, founded in the Greek world, in Athens especially. And this was sort of expanded upon during various times in the Roman Empire. So Judea, the home of the Jews, did not believe in democracy. It did not have such a system, and it never tried to. But Torah and the Old Testament never talks about this. It never tells Jews to go and form this democratic society. So of course I don't understand whether Western values are found in Judaism. But ancient Jews were also some of the only people in that part of the ancient world to be strongly anti-homosexual, because as we all know, in the ancient world it was more accepted. People didn't really make a big deal about it. People like Alexander the Great had a wife but also had a boyfriend and stuff. It wasn't a big deal, but in Judaism it still was a big deal. And Judaism itself contains some of the most strict and brutal stories in the Bible. As a Catholic, of course, I was raised on talking about the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it's easy to see how genocidal and angry and petty God is in the Old Testament. He's pretty brutal overall. So to think this religion really had any bearing on today's modern morals and I guess Western democracy is pretty laughable. Just because you have the 10 Commandments, which say things like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, doesn't mean it's the bedrock of modern law or modern values. Because in atheist opinion, in my opinion, man created religion and it's just a reflection of man. So men broadly know that I guess killing people is wrong to some degree, or taking what is not yours is wrong to some degree, and that's why they wrote it out in the 10 Commandments. There's numerous societies that have legal codes that say similar things, just like the Greeks and Romans often did. But it didn't take some divine inspiration. It didn't take a God coming down and telling them these are the laws, and before that somehow there was no law and no morals because God had to tell them. Of course that it is bullshit, and we know this. And yet in atheist opinion, man made religion and man made these rules anyway. Now we've covered the Jewish aspect, let's get into the Christian aspect. So when the Roman Empire fell and Christian monarchies started dividing up Europe, it really plunged the whole of the region into the Dark Ages. The monarchies and the Vatican worked together to control the population. Most people couldn't read the Bible. Culture really stagnated. It was really an oppressive time, and a pretty brutal time. Loads of people dying from things like the Black Death and the plague. Most people couldn't read, and it was really a time where the monarchies had strict control over the peasants. It wasn't a time of culture, and it wasn't a time of morals. So in this time, and still today, most Christians believe that the Pope talks to God. So obviously he's carrying out the Pope's will. And obviously in this time as well, all the European monarchs believe God had chosen them to rule over the people. So in these terms, this sort of Christianity was responsible for oppression and repression of all these things that the Romans and the Greeks had invented and made strives for. People weren't debating about philosophy. People weren't even coming close to forming the modern society we see today. People weren't talking about democracy and the type of morals we have today. They were burning witches at the stake. They were burning homosexuals at the stake. They were killing heathens. They were killing heretics. There's various crusades against Muslims, but also various crusades against different types of Christians. So it wasn't really a time of enlightenment. And to think that this combined with the ancient Jews somehow gave birth to modern Western democracy, gave us these Judeo-Christian values, which apparently are Western values. It's often just an argument, modern day Christians and Jews make today to take credit for the secular reforms and just say, obviously because these people might have been Christian, it's Christian beliefs. And we see here what a Christian society gets us, and we see what a Jewish society looks like as well. So only when Western European countries started moving away from, I guess, authoritarian Christian rule did we really see these sort of morals which we have today really come back into the forefront. And of course, the first instance I am talking about is the Renaissance. And obviously the Renaissance's home is Italy, and that's also the home of the Roman Empire. It had quite close ties, Italy with Greeks as well, especially Sicily. But what happens in this time is, various cultures come back in a big way, loads of inventions, loads of the greatest minds of this time, and it's really, a new birth of culture. And the city-states get more prominent as well in Italy rather than the monarchy. They start even challenging the Pope's rule, and you have all these different conflicts in the region at the time. But yeah, it's really, a way that culture reflourishes in the world. And a lot of these people look back towards the Romans and the Greeks for inspiration for the Renaissance. So again, it's these people looking back in time and being like, remember this time in history where humans had it so much better in a way, so much more cultured, had all these morals. It wouldn't be better if we had some of this in our life rather than the strict monarchical rule of European Christians. So yeah, make no mistake, these people were Christians, a lot of them are pretty religious as well, but also to sort of just challenge the whole Vatican's control on everything. And also some city-states like Venice and Genoa, they started trading with the Ottomans before they took over Constantinople, and they traded with the Ottomans afterwards. It was also a cultural exchange between groups like this. So yeah, it was a time that sort of led the way for the early modern period, and it was a period where culture flourished a lot more than it did in the medieval times. So a couple decades after the Renaissance, you also had the Catholic Church being challenged again, and that is by the Protestant Reformation. Now, I'm not trying to paint the Protestant Reformation as a time when loads of liberals became Protestants, because Protestantism at this time, was still really, really strict. It was pretty austere, and they believed in a lot of the horrible things that Catholics believe. But what I think it does is show that the total control by the Vatican over Europe, could be challenged, and in part that was responsible for how, bad the culture was in the Dark Ages and how bad the morals were. And Martin Luther just challenged that, didn't he? He stuck his grievances to the door of why the church was so corrupt, why it was so backwards, why they weren't really following the teachings of the Bible and Jesus, why he felt everyone should be able to read the Bible and really worship him in a more, austere manner, because that is what they should be like, because Jesus was like that. And that really challenged the Vatican orthodoxy in the region, and of course it led to many civil wars and really brutal conflict. And in England you had obviously Henry VIII becoming Protestant, but he changed it really just to be Catholicism without the Pope and him as the leader of the church. But it was a time when all these things were challenged, and I feel the main point of it is that people were beginning to challenge the rule of the Vatican. And of course it has its roots in the 1300s. John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English and tried to get peasants to read it and teach them to read, and then this inspired the Hussite rebellion in Bohemia, who rebelled against the Vatican because they wanted to follow their own version of Christianity, which they eventually got to, even though they were still subservient to the Pope. So it was an interesting time in terms of challenging these Christian values. So then comes the Enlightenment. It's a pretty broad term, but in general we sort of see it as the birth of modern society, and two massive revolutions obviously embody this, and that is the American Revolution and the French Revolution in the late 1700s. Now, the American Revolution, as I go over in my video, so please check that out, was led by unconventional Christians, deists and atheists who were really challenging this sort of view I was talking about, where kings of places like England and France believed God had chosen them to rule over them. So King George III was another one, and he was really exploiting his people, and a lot of these revolutionaries said, this is enough, we're going to form our own society, we're going to look back at how the Greeks did it, we're going to go for democracy over total rule by kings. Even though England did have the parliamentary system, it was still, not really democracy because the king had the final say. And it was a time where so many challenged what they'd been living with for 1,000 years essentially, more than that. And you had culture, which was way better, unrestricted by Christian censorship in a lot of ways. You had all these different things coming out of this period, all these great philosophers, all these great thinkers, because they were all looking back to the ancient values of the Romans and in particular the Greeks, and thinking about, where did we go wrong? Here's how we're going to get all this knowledge back. We're going to, really challenge how we've been thinking this whole time in Europe. So please check out my older video to really get an insight into the American Revolution in particular and the different figures. For example, Thomas Jefferson edited all the miracles out of the Bible. Can you imagine someone in America today getting elected president if it had been found they had edited all the miracles out of the Bible? That just wouldn't happen. So go check that video out. But yeah, it's safe to say all the things we hold dear today, like freedom of speech, democracy, things like that, obviously don't come from the Bible or the Torah. They come from people who led revolutions against these types of groups to give us, all the things people like the Greeks had invented and adapted it to a modern society. Now, I'm not saying the American Revolution was perfect. I don't believe it's everything it was cracked up to be. Obviously, rich, white, slave owners you know, you can make the argument they just wanted to be in charge of the capital in America rather than the King of England. And I think that's a good argument to make, and I do believe, you know, that it influenced it in part. But you can't deny a lot of these ideas these people were pushing, and a lot of their way of thinking was very different from the orthodoxy at the time. So yeah, like I was saying before, saying Judeo-Christian values are really responsible for our modern system is obviously just Christians and Jews trying to take credit for the secular reforms of all these people I've been talking about. But it's also very contradictory in the sense that Judaism and Christianity aren't similar. It's like saying Christian Muslim morals or something. But because of, you know, our Western alliance with all these countries, we've changed it to Judeo-Christian. So while the Old Testament is of course part of Christianity, it's very different if you just believe the Old Testament on its own, or the Old Testament with the New Testament, where Jesus is a central figure. And of course that is very different on the surface as well, but also what is interesting to me is that the main tormentor and oppressor of the Jews for the last 2,000 years has been Christians, but suddenly in the post-war period, you know, Christians are putting Judeo-Christian values in with everything. So for centuries, Christians expelled all the Jewish communities from places like France, Spain, England, and they also, you know, did many pogroms against the Jews. On the way to the First Crusade, the People's Crusade, which was mainly peasants, slaughtered every Hungarian Jew they came across for killing Jesus. The Nazis used the same logic to persecute the Jews in Germany, and of course get German Christians on board of doing the Holocaust, saying the Jews have obviously killed Jesus, let's kill them basically. And so it doesn't really make sense to me that now we're putting Judeo-Christian values where one group has been butchering the other for like 2,000 years. It doesn't really make much sense to me, because the only reason it's been added is because in the 50s the US became really strong allies with Israel, and Israel is of course a part of the West now, so we say Judeo-Christian values because of Israel. It's not because, you know, Christians really believe that their religion is similar to Jews, and of course Christians have always hated the Jews. White nationalist Christians at the moment shooting up synagogues, lots of anti-Semitic Christian rhetoric coming out from places like Hungary and stuff. So it really isn't, you know, Judeo-Christian values, this is all one thing. It's just, you know, the argument we make now because of Israel and because of people like Ben Shapiro, who of course they themselves are Jewish, to kind of fit in with the, I guess, the far-right conservative Christians in America. So we've got through all of that, but, you know, you might be asking yourself, how is Judeo-Christian values a term steeped in racism? You know, you've pointed out how stupid it is, you pointed out how ridiculous it is, but how is it racist? So a big part of the use of this term Judeo-Christian values is in dealing with Islamic countries and Islamic migrants, because we believe, you know, our Judeo-Christian values are so superior, they're so much better than Islamic values. Look how tolerant we are, look at the freedom of speech, look at the democracy, it's so much better than, you know, those Arabs and those Muslims. And when Muslim migrants come over, you know, are they a threat because they might not believe in our Judeo-Christian values, they might want to attack it with Sharia law and stuff? You know, our values are so superior, we've got to thank the Jews and the Christians for giving us all these enlightened values, and we're so much better than everyone. And of course they normally use it in dealing with non-white communities as well and non-white societies. It's not like we say America, because it's more Christian, is so much more superior than France or Norway, which are more socialist. You know, that never happens. It's a blanket term for all these countries. Even though they're very different in themselves, it's never used against another white country. We don't say, yeah, we have Judeo-Christian values but Russia doesn't. We never say stuff like that, but we're like, you know, Saudi Arabia doesn't, Egypt doesn't. We have Judeo-Christian values, they have backwards values. But I also don't think these Judeo-Christian values and the people who talk about them, they don't believe that non-white Christians and Jews believe in these things. So for example, do Ugandan Christians who live in a strict Christian society, do they fall into Judeo-Christian society? I would highly doubt Ben Shapiro would say Uganda is part of Judeo-Christian society. Now, are Ethiopian Jews, are they part of the Judeo-Christian society? Again, I'm not sure, you know, how strict or fundamentalist Ethiopian Jews are, but I'm pretty sure Ben Shapiro is not talking about Ethiopian Jews when he talks about Judeo-Christians and Judeo-Christian society. You know, I don't think Ben Shapiro is talking about how many benefits Uganda has given society. And this goes to show the hypocrisy of this term, but also the racism of this term, because, you know, obviously these non-white Christian and Jewish groups would definitely not be included. Now, sometimes you do get non-white groups accepted into the Judeo-Christian, you know, hegemony, the Judeo-Christian values and Western beliefs, so Japan, for example, but that mainly is because Japan had their constitution and their values, you know, designed by the US military, who basically gave them the US system in a lot of ways. They gave them this democratic system. So they're an acceptable member because, you know, of course the US is so great, it bestowed upon them Judeo-Christian values. They have the exact same values as the US now. And of course, you know, this is a bit of a ridiculous argument, but that's what these guys believe. And of course, maybe another country like India would be a good example, the largest democracy in the world, because of course they adopted a system similar to the British and maybe more similar to the US system in terms of their congresses and stuff. So of course, people like Ben Shapiro might consider some non-white groups, you know, part of the Judeo-Christian values and everything, but at the same time, this is only because they've adopted the system that countries like America use. And what Ben Shapiro often does as well, and people like him, they completely minimize or dismiss the cultural, you know, milestones and, you know, what places like India, China, and the Middle East have given us. So, you know, China and India are the birth of many philosophical and technological revolutions. You have people like Ashoka, Confucius, Sun Tzu, Zhuge Liang. You have others like Buddha. You have others like Akbar. And these people are completely ignored, even though they are part of, you know, modern society and they have a massive influence on these regions. But of course they're sort of ignored in favour of the Judeo-Christian values, which basically plunged Europe into the Dark Ages for 1,000 years. So, you know, it's not like these people might have been more enlightened, because a lot of them were. It's because, you know, our values must be better because we live in a Judeo-Christian society, you know, founded by the enlightened Christians and Jews, apparently. So what it does, it puts Judeo-Christian values equal good, rest of the world is either lesser or bad. And this type of racism is known as cultural racism. It creates a hierarchy of culture. So in Ben Shapiro's mind, the Judeo-Christian culture gave us freedom of speech, it gave us freedom of religion, it gave us democracy, it gave us tolerance, it gave us all these things. And all the other cultures, they're just not as good as these because they don't really, you know, they didn't invent these things, apparently. It's us, it's the West who did this, it's the Jews and the Christians who did this. So people like Ben Shapiro probably think that Arab culture and Islamic culture is, you know, just represents authoritarianism, it represents oppression, it represents violence in their opinion, whereas Judeo-Christian, you know, represents intelligence, it represents people being smart and calculated, it represents people being, you know, open to negotiation. We're not as rash, we're not as emotional. And that is the cultural racism that is, you know, embedded in this Judeo-Christian values term. And it is a nice coincidence that pretty much all these other societies are non-white ones compared to the white ones. So that's why I often think Judeo-Christian is just a stand-in term for white values. Now, have we seen this cultural racism and these, you know, people believing in this Judeo-Christian bullshit, you know, really manifest itself in a big way? Well, yeah, we sort of have. So, for example, in the George Bush Jr. administration, the neoconservatives believed, basically, that, you know, American culture, Judeo-Christian culture, is the best, and it should be exported around the world. So what people don't know a lot of the time is that what the Bush administration wanted to do was invade a lot of countries in the Middle East, topple the authoritarian regimes, and really install American free market capitalist democracies. So you had countries like Iran, North Korea, you had countries like Sudan, you had countries like Libya and Syria. They're all on the chopping block for the US to go and topple the dictators and put in, you know, this Judeo-Christian culture, this westernized system. And, you know, that is the cultural racism at play, because they thought, you know, this is surely the pinnacle of human society, you know. We must give all these backwards people, you know, the benefits we have, and the benefits we have, you know, as Jews and Christians have invented, because we're so enlightened, we're so benevolent. Here you go, everyone else, have this great system we've invented. We're going to help you form this wonderful system. Obviously, that's not the way it went in the end, because there was a massive backlash against it. And of course, you can't just expect to go into a country, topple their government, and then put in your version of the government and expect everything to go fine. And it also translates to the way conservatives and neoconservatives, you know, view non-white people. So a lot of the time in Islamic communities in Britain and, you know, the United States, they are treated with skepticism. They are treated, you know, as aliens. A lot of them aren't seen as patriots, even if they are patriotic Americans, because, you know, because they're non-white, because, you know, they might, you know, have some loyalty to something like Islam. They, of course, cannot believe in Judeo-Christian values like you can, the conservatives. So they are treated with a lot of skepticism, and this is why, you know, the fear-mongering about, you know, the Great Replacement, where, of course, people say that because Muslim communities will have more children, Muslims will become a bigger majority in the Western countries, and cultural racism comes into play because it means you inherently think that all people who are Muslim are inherently backwards. You believe their culture is inferior. You believe, maybe the stereotypes that a lot of people bang on about, in terms of Tommy Robinson talking about how Muslims are more prone to grooming gangs, more prone to violence, more prone to paedophilia, things like that. And that is the cultural racism at play in that regard. So the cultural racism makes these people look down on groups in their own society with skepticism, because they believe, how can you truly be for the same values as me? Because they believe they're superior and other cultures are so backwards. Now, I also think Judeo-Christian values as a term is a relic of Orientalism. And now you might ask, isn't Orientalism and racism the same? Well, they're pretty similar, but I think Orientalism is pretty specific. So for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure a lot of you do, it's pretty standard political text. There is an author called Edward Said who wrote a book called Orientalism, in which he deals with the issues of power and knowledge in regards to colonialism. So to outline my point, one story he tells is that there's a former Egyptian official who goes back to England, because at this time England and Britain owned Egypt, and he wrote a book about his experiences in Egypt, and he was called Lord Cromer. And basically what he did is that he painted the Egyptian people in a certain way. He said they were lazy, he said they were scheming, that they'd do anything to get out of an honest day's work. They're always trying to trick you and stuff, because they didn't have the enlightened values of this Judeo-Christian society. Their society was completely backwards. And in this regard, because Britain had the power, they also had the knowledge. So that means they had the power to spread this myth about Egypt being backward, spread it to, a lot of European countries. Look how backwards the Orient is, in terms of this generalized term they like to describe the whole of the East with. Look how backward they are. We are bringing them civilization. We are bringing them all these values we hold dear. We're making their society better by being there. They're like children to be led by us, because our Judeo-Christian values give us such great morals, give us such great, values, that we must bring that to the rest of the world, because everything they believe in must be inferior, because of course the cultural racism is at play. And I believe the neoconservatives at the time of the Bush administration, they believe the exact same thing. The Iraqis are backwards, the Iranians are backwards, the Syrians are backwards. We must come in and we must form a democracy for them. We must give them this, huge benefit we've come up with in the West. We must give it to all of these people, because that is of course the pinnacle of human civilization. That is, of course, what we should all aspire to be like. We should all have these Judeo-Christian values. We should all have this westernized democracy. And let's go bring it to these countries. But of course, this is really steeped in racism. You can't deny that as anything other than racism, because you're believing all these people to be inferior to you. And you must come in and help them, like their children, like Lord Cromer was saying about these people. So to summarise, when you hear people like Ben Shapiro or Nigel Farage bang on about Judeo-Christian culture, just remember a few things. Most of the benefits of Western society that you value come in spite of religion. It comes from people pushing back against religion. It comes from atheists, it comes from deists, it comes from non-conventional Christians who really challenge the authority of the day. It's not from Christians, who oppress Europe for like 1,000+ years. It's not from conservative Jews who believe this conservative version of Judaism, because, a proper reading of the Bible and the Torah do not give you freedom of speech. They do not give you democracy. They do not give you these Western values, because they never, advocate for it in their text. Of course, a lot of the people who did give us these things were Christians, but they did it in spite of the religion, not because of it. Most of the things came from people looking back at the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans and other ancient societies. It didn't come from looking back at, hey, wasn't 900 AD Europe a great place, or wasn't the medieval times an amazing place to live? Let's go back to that system where Christian monarchies ruled the whole continent. No, it wasn't like that. It's also a term entrenched in Orientalist racism, where Judeo-Christian values, or white values as I outlined, because of course we don't really think that Ugandan Christians or Ethiopian Jews fit into this narrative, do we? We're not that naive to think that Ben Shapiro thinks a country like Uganda, that's super oppressive because of its strict adherence to Christianity, is part of these, Judeo-Christian society. And it's obviously a term where we think our values in the West, our white values, our Judeo-Christian values, they're superior to everyone else's, and that is what everyone should seek to achieve, and we should go give them these values, essentially. That's what neocons believe as well. Just as Lord Cromer looked down on the Egyptians, Ben Shapiro looks down upon others, just like the Egyptians were painted in this time. He says that Arabs like to bomb things, and that is clear cultural racism. It's clear Orientalism as well. and he's just, using a stereotype of terrorists to paint all Arabs. So it's obvious that Judeo-Christian values and all the stuff associated with Judeo-Christianity is of course false in its, inception. Nothing really that we have that's good in our Western society is really from the Bible, is really from the Torah, but it's also a term entrenched in racism, because it just paints, this white Western culture as superior to everything. And it's also just a bit annoying because it's, white Western Christians and Jews trying to take credit for secular reforms. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment. Please like the video and maybe subscribe if you're new. You can find me at social media at The Tabernacle on both Twitter and Instagram. I also have a WordPress blog, which is just The Tabernacle WordPress, so maybe check that out. I write some things. I also have a Patreon, so the link is in the description. I'm pretty much just trying to get a new camera, a new microphone, maybe a green screen. So if you like my content, maybe just give that a little look. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.